On February 24, 1986, the Los Angeles Police Department discovered the lifeless body of 29-year-old Sherri Rasmussen, brutally injured and tragically lying on the floor. Inside the home, the scene was disordered. Furniture had been overturned, stereo equipment was ripped from the walls, and a broken porcelain vase hinted at the violence Sherri had endured. To detectives, the evidence pointed to a single conclusion: a robbery gone wrong. However, the autopsy reports revealed a different story. Something unusual caught the investigators' attention: a bite mark on Sherri's left arm. What really happened to Sherri? Was it just a robbery, or was there a more sinister, vengeful motive behind her death? In May 1984, Sherri met John Rutin. The two quickly hit it off and began dating. A year later, they decided to marry, and John moved into Sherri's apartment. On February 24, 1986, John left their condo on Balboa Boulevard to begin his new job. Meanwhile, Sherri was scheduled to give a motivational speech at work that day. Around 9:45 a.m., a neighbor noticed something strange. John's garage door was open, but there was no car inside. John had ensured that all doors were closed before leaving, making this unusual. About 15 minutes later, John called home, but no one answered. He assumed Sherri had gone to work and dismissed the concern. But as the day went on, his calls continued to go unanswered. John started to wonder. However, after checking in with Sherri's secretary and learning she hadn't shown up for work, John's worry meter spiked. Meanwhile, Sherri's sister, Teresa Lane, also reached out, calling her office around 10 a.m. A twist in the tale emerged when a maid cleaning a nearby unit reported hearing what sounded like a heated argument, followed by a loud thud around 12:30 p.m. When John arrived home from work at 6 p.m., he sensed something wasn't right. The garage door, usually closed, was wide open, and Sherri's BMW, the one he had given her as an engagement present, was nowhere to be seen. Considering Sherri's earlier plans, it seemed odd that she would have left without telling him. As John walked closer to the garage, he spotted scattered pieces of broken glass and quickly realized where it came from. Above the garage was a small balcony, and its glass door had been smashed. John stepped into the house through the garage. There lay Sherri, sprawled on the floor with her body horribly injured. Her eyes were swollen, and she had cuts and bruises all over her body, even on her head and neck. By the time John found her, she had been lying there for a while, and her body was stiff and cold. John desperately searched for a pulse and tried to revive her, but sadly, there was no response. Being panicked, he dialed 911, and soon enough, the police and paramedics rushed to the scene. As the detectives combed through the crime scene, they were met with utter chaos in every room. Furniture was tossed around, and it was clear there had been a violent struggle. A broken porcelain vase hinted at the severity of the attack on Sherri. Adding to the eerie scene, they discovered a handprint of blood near the alarm system the couple had recently installed. It seemed Sherri had desperately tried to trigger the alarm to let someone know she needed help. But tragically, she couldn't quite reach it in time. Inside the house, it was clear that the struggle had been intense, especially in the lounge room. The detectives found tall stereo speakers, one of which had been ripped from the wall and left on the floor near Sherri's body. As they continued their investigation, they collected more evidence from both the scene and from Sherri's body. They dusted for fingerprints around the house and also used an assault kit to gather swabs from the bite marks they found on Sherri's arms. The detectives also discovered abrasions on Sherri's wrists, which suggested that she had been tied up with a rope or cord, which they found near the front door. It was clear she had fought so hard that her fingernails broke off in the struggle. Adding to the horror, they also uncovered evidence that she had been shot 3 times in the chest. This shocking revelation led them to conclude that despite all her other injuries, the gunshots were ultimately what caused her death. One bullet had gone through Sherri's body, leaving an exit wound on her back, while the other 2 were found inside her. It was clear they were shot from a .38 caliber handgun fired at very close range. Adding to the mystery, detectives found a colorful quilted blanket on a chair in the living room. It had 2 holes and powder burns, which was suggesting that it was used to muffle the sound of the gunshots. With all this evidence, the police swiftly concluded that this was no ordinary crime. It was a botched robbery, gone terribly wrong. According to the police, it seemed like at least 2 criminals broke into Sherri's apartment, but they didn't expect her to be there. So a fierce struggle broke out between them and Sherri, who fought bravely until the end. Several clues pointed toward a robbery gone wrong. First, Sherri's car was missing from the garage, indicating the robber's intent to steal. Secondly, stereo equipment and a player were found near the staircase, which suggested the thieves planned to take them before the confrontation. However, things took a deadly turn during the scuffle, leading to Sherri's tragic murder. But this robbery theory had its flaws. First, the police didn't find any signs of forced entry. This meant the criminals either had a key to Sherri's apartment or she let them in herself. Secondly, all valuable items including a jewelry box were left untouched, which raised doubts about the motive behind the break-in. Despite interviewing all of Sherri's neighbors, detectives came up empty-handed. While some residents heard sounds of a struggle, none of them reported hearing gunshots or seeing anyone enter Sherri's apartment. Experts also collected blood samples and fingerprints from the house, hoping to find clues to solve the case. However, DNA analysis wasn't possible at the time in 1980s. To gather more evidence, the lead investigator had an idea. He took a piece of cotton and dabbed it on the bite mark found on Sherri's body. He hoped that if the attacker's saliva was left behind, it could be a vital clue in catching the killer. After their thorough search of the apartment, detectives stumbled upon an intriguing detail. The criminals had taken only one item, which was Sherri and John's marriage certificate. This raised eyebrows and suspicions, especially towards John, who was closest to Sherri and could have had easy access to the apartment. However, John was quickly ruled out as a suspect in his wife's murder because he had a solid alibi and no apparent motive. In fact, he was the one who informed the police about the missing certificate, further clearing his name. At the time, detectives couldn't make sense of why the criminals took only Sherri and John's marriage certificate. Still stuck on their robbery theory, they focused on finding the perpetrators. After a week and a half of searching, they made a breakthrough. Sherri's car was found in a parking lot, for kilometers from her apartment. In these incidents, 2 criminals would break into apartments through the garage, brandishing guns and stealing stereo equipment. The lead detective suspected that the same culprits might be behind Sherri's murder. They tried to track them down using witness accounts, grading rough sketches of the suspects. They also learned that both men were Latino. However, despite their efforts, the suspects were never found. This lack of progress frustrated Sherri's parents, who felt like investigators weren't doing enough to uncover the truth behind their daughter's tragic death. Nels Rasmussen, Sherri's father, wasn't convinced by the police's burglary theory. He regularly visited the police station, urging the detectives to consider other possibilities. He found it hard to believe that Sherri, who was tall, strong, and in good shape, could have been overpowered in a botched burglary. Nels was determined to get to the bottom of what truly happened to his daughter, pushing for a more thorough investigation into the case. Nels urged the police to look into John's ex-girlfriend, whom he didn't know by name because Sherri never mentioned it. However, Sherri did confide in her father about the unsettling feelings she got from the ex-girlfriend's unexpected visits. But who was this mysterious woman and what was her connection to John? Well, her name was Stephanie Lazarus, and she wasn't just any ordinary ex-girlfriend. She was an LAPD officer. Right from the start, Stephanie developed strong feelings for John, but he remained oblivious to her romantic intentions. He saw her just as a good friend and was unaware of her deeper feelings towards him. To John, their relationship was nothing more than friendship, occasionally mixed with physical intimacy, and he assumed this was clear to everyone. Because of this, he never felt the need to discuss feelings with Stephanie or ask about hers. On the other hand, Stephanie was painfully aware of John's lack of romantic interest in her. So when Stephanie learned of John's engagement to Sherri on June 4th, 1985, it was a crushing blow. That night, Stephanie dialed John's number and her voice was trembling as she pleaded, "I really need to see you. Please come over." Being concerned, John agreed and hurried to Stephanie's house. When he arrived, he found her still in tears, which worried him deeply. Despite knowing Stephanie for 7 years, he had never seen her so upset before. He tried to soothe her, but before he could say anything, Stephanie suddenly poured her heart out, confessing her love for him. "I love you," she declared. "I've loved you all this time. I just couldn't bear to see you marry someone else." John was taken aback by Stephanie's confession, but he was confident that their relationship had always been clear-cut. He gently explained to her that he didn't share the same feelings and that he was deeply in love with Sherri. However, despite his refusal, Stephanie persisted and pleaded with John one last time to sleep with her. Feeling sorry for Stephanie, John reluctantly agreed, but made it clear that it would be the final time they were together and that they could not see each other anymore after that. At this point, Sherri had no idea about the complicated relationship between John and Stephanie. Little did she know, Stephanie had more surprising schemes up her sleeve that would soon disrupt their lives. In August 1985, Stephanie made an unexpected visit to the Glendale Adventist Medical Center, where Sherri worked. Stephanie headed to Sherri's office for a private conversation. They closed the door, and their discussion lasted for a few minutes. When Stephanie eventually left, Sherri emerged from her office looking visibly distressed, tears in her eyes. It was evident to everyone that something had deeply upset Sherri. That evening, Sherri reached out to her father Nels and confided in him about the unsettling encounter with Stephanie. While she didn't disclose Stephanie's name, she shared the disturbing message she received. If John couldn't be with Stephanie, then he couldn't be with anyone else either. But Stephanie's intrusive behavior didn't end there. During her second visit, she showed up at Sherri's apartment and asked John to wax her skis. Despite Sherri's objections, John complied with Stephanie's request. Sherri found her behavior odd, especially considering she was dressed in a flattering workout attire. After Stephanie left, Sherri confronted John and questioned him whether their relationship was truly over. John reassured her that he and Stephanie were just friends. However, a few days later, Stephanie returned to retrieve her skis, this time dressed in her police uniform and armed. Sherri grew increasingly unnerved by Stephanie's persistent visits and pleaded with John to put an end to them. However, John dismissed her concerns while insisting there was nothing more to their relationship and advised her to ignore Stephanie's action. But Sherri couldn't shake off her nagging suspicions about Stephanie's mysterious appearances and how she managed to bypass the security measures at their residential complex. On one occasion, while dining with John in a restaurant, Sherri caught sight of a hooded figure staring at them. The moment she glanced back, the mysterious person swiftly disappeared. Sherri couldn't discern his identity because his face was concealed. Being desperate for answers, Sherri's father shared these unsettling incidents with the detectives in the hope that they would take his concerns seriously. However, their indifference only deepened the family's frustration and anxiety. Detectives were certain that the murder was the work of the two men who had recently burgled an apartment near Sherri's residence. However, 3 months after the tragic incident, a curious turn of events unfolded. Several crucial documents pertaining to Sherri's case mysteriously vanished from the police station. These included the detectives' detailed records documenting the ongoing investigation's progress. Yet, inexplicably, they couldn't be located. This disappearance raised serious doubts. Was it a genuine mishap? Or had someone intentionally removed these documents from the case files? The victim's family suspected foul play, especially considering the involvement of an LAPD officer in the case. However, there were no significant leads, and the case remained unsolved for years. 7 years later, when the lead investigator mayor retired, Sherri's father saw it as an opportunity and decided to meet his successor, hoping for a more committed approach to the case. Sherri's father requested the detective to conduct a DNA analysis and even offered to cover the expenses. However, the detective dismissed the idea, deeming it pointless because they didn't have a suspect to compare the DNA profile with. The detective asked him to move on, maintaining their belief that Sherri's case was simply a botched robbery. Meanwhile, John moved on with his life and started a new family. However, a peculiar turn of events occurred when he reconnected with Stephanie, and they made plans to travel to Hawaii together. But just before their trip, something unexpected unfolded. John contacted the police himself, inquiring about any new evidence that would link Stephanie to Sherri's murder. It turned out that John suspected Stephanie's involvement in Sherri's murder and was determined to seek justice for her. However, he kept this suspicion to himself for years and hesitated to speak about it, even though he continued his intimate relationship with Stephanie. 3 years later, she married a fellow officer and they adopted a daughter together, relocating to Simi Valley. Despite her impeccable reputation, Stephanie continued to meet John regularly and maintain their relationship. As time passed, it seemed like Sherri's murder would remain unsolved forever. However, in 2001, a glimmer of hope emerged when a separate cold case unit was established in Los Angeles to tackle unsolved murders. Sherri's case, along with thousands of others, was assigned to the detectives in this unit. Among the evidence was the piece of cotton that may have contained the perpetrator's saliva left behind after a bite during the attack. 2 years later, in 2003, detectives resumed their investigation into Sherri's case and sent all available evidence to the laboratory for DNA testing. However, it wasn't until December 2003 that a lab technician named Jennifer Francis began working on it. Due to a backlog of cases, they had to wait nearly 2 years for the results. Finally, in January 2005, Jennifer tested the blood samples from the apartment, as well as the fingernail clippings, and discovered that all the DNA belonged to Sherri herself. Now all that remained was to analyze the remaining sample from the bite mark on Sherri's body. However, there was a problem. The vial containing the sample couldn't be found for an entire day. After an exhaustive search, it was eventually discovered near the wall of a large refrigerator. It appeared as though someone had tried to remove all evidence linking to the killer, but by some stroke of luck, this crucial piece had been overlooked. After studying the sample, Francis detected that the DNA was from an unfamiliar woman. She quickly checked it against the FBI database, but to her surprise, there were no matches. Realizing the DNA belonged to a woman, she delved deeper and found a report about a third-party female who supposedly harassed the victim before her death, both at work and at home. Francis, curious about the possible connection, asked the detective overseeing her if this woman had been investigated. His response startled her. "Oh, you mean the LAPD detective?" He went on to explain that the woman in question was a former girlfriend of the victim's husband and was currently serving as an LAPD detective. However, he quickly dismissed any involvement by stating firmly, "She's not a part of this." They didn't entertain other possibilities, and after hitting a dead end in their search for new leads, the case once again went cold. Sherri's case had its share of challenges, with progress often stalled by dead ends. However, in February 2009, a fresh opportunity emerged when Jim Nuttall and Pete Barbera took on the investigation in Van Nuys. They carefully reviewed the materials left by previous investigators. With the DNA evidence indicating a female suspect, they dismissed the burglary theory and realized they needed to retrace their steps from the beginning. Nuttall and Barba considered it as a murder rather than a simple burglary. They believed the burglary was staged to divert attention from the real motive. Several aspects of the crime scene didn't add up for a typical break-in, especially one that happened during the day. Sherri's jewelry box, an obvious target for thieves, was left untouched on her dresser, so they decided to make a list of all the women who could potentially be linked to Sherri's murder. After some investigation, they gathered 5 names, including one of Sherri's colleagues from work, 3 other young women, and Stephanie. Nuttall was surprised when John informed him over the phone that Stephanie was a police officer. At the time, Stephanie had been promoted to a higher rank of detective and was working on art theft cases as part of the Commercial Crimes Division. With the assistance of other investigators, they swiftly ruled out the 3 women from the list as they lacked motives and had solid alibis. Next, they turned their attention to the nurse who worked with Sherri. The case file indicated that there were tense relations between them, so the police discreetly obtained a sample of her DNA from the trash she discarded. Experts analyzed the profile extracted from the sample, but found that it didn't match the saliva found at the bite mark. Consequently, the detectives were left with only one remaining suspect, Stephanie Lazarus. However, during this process, the detectives and their colleagues made a pact to keep this information under wraps until they could gather concrete evidence against Stephanie or rule out her involvement. By keeping it quiet, They aimed to prevent her from preparing a strong defense if she was indeed the killer. It was intriguingly convenient that Stephanie worked in the same building and on the same floor as them. So to maintain secrecy, they adopted numerous precautions, even avoiding mentioning her name in the notes. Instead, Stephanie was simply referred to as Number 5. As they delved deeper into Stephanie's life during the mid-1980s, they stumbled upon their first intriguing discovery. During the time of the murder, Stephanie owned a Smith & Wesson Model 4938 caliber revolver, the same type of gun used to shoot Sherri. Additionally, investigators discovered that Sherri had frequently complained about Stephanie's odd and sometimes aggressive behavior. The plot thickened when they learned that Stephanie had broken into Sherri's gated community and even into her apartment on multiple occasions. In a final blow, the detectives uncovered that just 2 weeks after the murder, Stephanie made a peculiar report at the police station. She claimed that her car, parked near the pier, had been broken into, and among the stolen items was a .38 caliber revolver. This revelation raised eyebrows among investigators, especially considering the circumstances surrounding Sherri's murder. It seemed highly suspicious that Stephanie would conveniently report the theft of a weapon similar to the one used in the crime. With Stephanie emerging as the prime suspect, the detectives wasted no time in informing their superiors. They devised a plan to discreetly collect a DNA sample for her, opting for a voluntary discard to avoid tipping her off about the investigation. For a whole week, undercover officers shadowed Stephanie's every move and waited for the perfect moment. Then, on May 28, 2009, their chance finally arrived. Stephanie and her stepdaughter popped into a cafe for a quick snack. As soon as they exited, the officers swiftly swooped in and grabbed the glass Stephanie had sipped from. Without hesitation, they sent it straight to the lab for analysis, hoping it would finally crack the case wide open. The following day, the lab delivered the results, and it was a bombshell. The DNA from Stephanie's glass was a perfect match to the DNA found at the bite mark from Sherri's body. It confirmed what the detectives had suspected all along. Stephanie was indeed Sherri's killer. The revelation sent a chilling possibility that Stephanie may have been behind the disappearance of crucial documents from the initial investigation and erased any trace of her involvement. However, the undeniable DNA results left no room for doubt. With little time for contemplation, the investigators swiftly shifted their focus to developing a plan for Stephanie's arrest. The detectives even thought over the idea of apprehending Stephanie at her residence, but the thought of confronting her while she was with her husband and stepdaughter seemed fraught with risk. Instead, they brainstormed on how to compel someone of Stephanie's rank to surrender their weapon. Eventually, they hit upon a brilliant solution. The basement of the police department housed holding cells meant for temporary detention of criminals, where anyone entering had to surrender their weapon. This ingenious plan provided the perfect opportunity to safely arrest Stephanie without complications of her family being involved. Now, to lure Stephanie to the basement holding cells, the detectives devised a clever plan. On June 5, 2009, 2 detectives approached her with hidden microphones. They told her they had arrested a suspect who might have intel on stolen paintings. Since Stephanie was experienced in dealing with art thefts, they sought her expertise. Stephanie willingly agreed to assist and accompanied the detectives to the basement where the suspect was purportedly held. As she surrendered her weapon, the first part of the plan fell into place. However, upon reaching the interrogation room, Stephanie was in for a surprise. Instead of finding a suspect, the detectives meticulously and cautiously began revealing their cards one by one. The detectives began by gently prodding Stephanie's memory, allowing her to share more about her past experiences. As Stephanie confessed her connection with John, the conversation naturally shifted towards Sherri. They asked Stephanie to recall her memories of Sherri and questioned her about the peculiarities of their interaction, such as the unexpected visits and incidents that could link her to the murder. Throughout the interview, Stephanie became increasingly tense and defensive whenever questioned about Sherri and attempted to deny any recollection of their past interactions. Despite her efforts to deflect and evade, Stephanie inadvertently revealed enough information about their history. Now it was time for the detectives to reveal the truth to her. After the interrogation, Stephanie was allowed to leave. But as she reached the end of the corridor, several policemen were waiting for her with handcuffs. It was a dramatic moment, marking 23 years since the murder as Stephanie was finally arrested. Even during the official questioning, she invoked her right to remain silent and adamantly denied any involvement, maintaining her innocence. With no confession forthcoming, the detectives had no option but to prepare the necessary documents for her transfer to court. Stephanie spent the next few years in a women's prison until her first court hearing that commenced in 2012. During the trial, the defense raised doubts about the DNA test results and highlighted the lack of prior suspicions against Stephanie. However, these arguments failed to convince the court. The prosecution presented their theory, alleging that on the day of the murder, Stephanie waited for John to leave for work before entering Sherri's apartment. Once inside, she confronted Sherri, which resulted in the struggle that moved downstairs. Ultimately, Stephanie incapacitated Sherri by breaking a vase over her head before fatally shooting her. Then, she staged a fake burglary scene to cover her tracks and left the scene after taking their marriage certificate. In her house, they stumbled upon a journal from the mid-1980s filled with entries detailing her love for John and her distress over his relationship with Sherri. However, there was no mention of her gun being stolen. Additionally, her computer history revealed multiple searches for John's name during the late 1990s. These findings added weight to the prosecution's case, painting a clearer picture of Stephanie's obsession with John and her potential motives for the crime. On March 8, 2012, Stephanie's fate was sealed as the jury declared her guilty of murder. The courtroom fell silent as the judge handed down a sentence of 27 years to life in prison, with an additional 2 years for using a service weapon. Stephanie was finally behind bars and John had moved on with his life. It's tragic to think that she took Sherri's life and ruined 3 lives in the process. But for what? In the end, Stephanie's attempts to make John love her were futile, and now she finds herself unhappy as well. If it weren't for dedicated detectives who took up the case, Sherri's story might have remained buried in dusty archives. But thanks to their expertise and the power of DNA evidence, justice was finally served. Sherri's parents finally found solace knowing that the person who took their daughter away from them was behind bars. Discover the chilling world of secret crime mysteries, where we delve into the most perplexing cold cases and unsolved crimes. Join us as we unravel hidden clues and explore haunting mysteries. Subscribe now and be part of the journey to bring these cases to light. In northern British Columbia, Canada, during the hot summer of July 2019, a young couple embraced the natural beauty of the region. Northern British Columbia, which stretches up to the Yukon-Alaska border, is surrounded by forests, valleys, volcanic rock formations, and mountains, a place full of endless opportunities for adventure. From hiking and fishing to skiing and wild water swimming, it offered everything for the adventurous spirit. One couple, the free-spirited and adventurous 24-year-old China Dees and 23-year-old Lucas Fowler, were enjoying a much-anticipated mini-vacation together. Lucas hailed from a large family in Sydney, Australia, and was the son of a New South Wales chief inspector. His passion for travel started early, and as he grew older, he dreamed of exploring as much of the world as possible. Hiking, camping, surfing, swimming, Lucas wanted to experience it all. This desire for adventure led him to embark on a 2-year backpacking journey around the globe, which took him to places like Croatia. It was there, in 2017, that he met China Dees, a young woman from North Carolina. China had studied in Europe and worked on a grape farm, saving up money to continue her travels. By that point, she had already visited 13 countries. It was clear they were a perfect match, and their connection was instant. Their families both loved each other and recognized that this was a relationship that would go the distance. They were full of happiness and joy just being together, Lucas's father, Stephen, said. The day she stole Lucas's heart, she became a part of the family. We were so happy he had met a life partner. China and Lucas spent as much time as they could together, despite the huge distance between them, and would talk for hours on the phone, reminiscing about their past trips and excitedly planning their future ones. In the 2 years they were together, they spent time in Central and South America, Japan, and Southeast Asia. The couple spent Christmas together in America with China's family before Lucas left to work on a ranch in British Columbia. Now that he had a visa, it meant that the 10,000 miles between the pair wasn't quite so big and scary anymore and much more feasible to work around. China soon joined him for a short holiday out there, and it was here that the pair made a plan to road trip through Canada together over the coming summer. They wanted to see as much as possible on the journey, and their final stop would be Alaska. Lucas spent time doing up his 1986 blue Chevrolet minivan in preparation, and he and China couldn't wait for the break, doing what they loved most together. On the evening of July 13th, with the trip now several days underway, the couple pulled into a gas station in Fort Nelson, British Columbia. CCTV showed them embracing, content and without a care in the world, before filling up their van and cleaning some of the windows. They paid and drove off. China, who had been texting her mother, Sheila, quite regularly, sent a message saying, "We won't have Wi-Fi for a while, so don't worry, Mom, and I love you." The following day, however, about 200 miles away, they hit a bump in the road. Their van broke down along the Alaska Highway, known as Highway 97, near a popular tourist area, Liard River Hot Springs. A fellow tourist named Charles noticed the broken-down van and stopped to help. But Lucas was happy and chatty and assured him it was all under control. He said they would carry on trying to fix it, but if they had no luck, they would call a tow truck in the morning where they could get some phone service. Charles told them he was going to be camping about 3 miles away and would come back in the morning to check on them. He left them sitting on the side of the road, eating some food, and happily embracing the situation that would likely stress most people out. At about 11:30 that night, with the couple still stranded and working on the vehicle, a road maintenance worker drove past. She saw a man with a beard talking to China and Lucas and described him as seeming frustrated, and the conversation appeared heated. She didn't stop, but she said something about seeing that encounter gave her a bad feeling. "If you just get a bad feeling, and that's what I had, you just don't stop," she later said. She recalled that both of the right doors of the couple's van were open, and it looked as if the man with the beard had come from a gray car nearby, but she couldn't be sure. July 15th, 6:20 a.m. A trucker going down Highway 97 spotted something in the distance that instantly caught his eye. As he pulled closer, he realized what it was he was looking at. It was the bodies of China and Lucas. They were face down in a ditch about 10 feet from their van and about 15 feet from each other. They were both cold to the touch and had been dead for some time. He called someone over to help and started frantically trying to redirect traffic and stop people from driving through. The police were now receiving multiple calls about this, and when they got to the scene at 7:20 a.m., they found the same trucker still doing his best to control the situation, but clearly distraught and very traumatized at what he had driven into. China and Lucas had been shot to death, and the medical examiner confirmed both entry and exit wounds. The van's back doors were open and the window was smashed. Nearby was 5 spent shell cases and China's phone. Lucas' phone was not found. Just after 9 a.m., Charles, the other tourist that had talked with them the day before, kept to his promise and drove back to check on them. When he was met with police blocks in the road, he simply couldn't believe this had happened. As word started to travel, the witness from the previous day gave the description of the man with the beard she saw talking to the couple. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police released a composite based on this and asked for anyone with dashcam footage to please come forward. Back in Australia, the news had also hit hard, and police over there offered their support to the Canadian authorities. Not only had they lost Lucas, but his father Stephen was a serving police officer, and they wanted to help him as much as they could. Another driver would then ask to talk to the police and told them that he had pulled over at the side of the road in the same area to take a quick nap. He said within 5 minutes of being parked, a small van drove past him and stopped about 50 yards ahead. A man got out of the passenger side holding a rifle. He then started quickly moving towards him holding the gun in a way the witness described as a hunting stance. The truck then started moving slowly towards him, too. The driver put his foot down and sped off, fearing for his life. He couldn't see their faces and didn't want to stop to look. 5 days later, on July 19th, another disturbing scene would unfold 300 miles away. Near Dease Lake in British Columbia, a burnt-out camper van was found. The number plate was still intact enough to run through the database, and it came back as belonging to 19-year-old Cam McLeod, who had been out on a road trip with his best friend, 18-year-old Briar Schmigalski. Cam and Briar were both from Vancouver, Ireland, and were colleagues at a Walmart. They had both recently quit, deciding to go to Yukon for work. They had left their homes on July 12th, a trip their family had described as a spur-of-the-moment one, but they were supportive nonetheless. The last anyone had seen of them before the van was found was when they had stopped for coffee at a place called Jade City, somewhere that was happy to offer a free coffee to drivers passing through. The owner of the store remembered them coming in, but said there was nothing unusual about their stop and they didn't seem to be in any distress or trouble. And now they were both missing, and their truck was burned and destroyed. To add more to the already unnerving story, about a mile away from the teens' burning van, the body of a man who had also been shot was found. He had no ID on him, so police released a sketch and description. He was believed to be in his 50s or 60s and had a big gray beard. Although this was a nearly 8-hour drive from where Lucas and China were found, was it possible that all these cases were connected? As authorities continued to look for the missing teens, the families of China and Lucas both flew in, faced with the unthinkable task of bringing their bodies home. Alan Schmigalski, Briar's father, said the last he had heard from his son was a text message saying that contact would likely be scarce due to a lack of phone service. When he saw his son's and Cam's faces on a paper, only then did he realize they were both missing. Cam had last made contact with his family on July 17th, saying he and Briar had made it to Yukon, which was their intended final stop. So what had made them carry on so far past it? Or had they actually even made it there in the first place? There were so many questions. In the space of just a few days, 3 people had been killed and 2 were now missing under deeply concerning circumstances. As the sketch of the third victim started circulating, a woman named Helen called in. She was the wife of 64-year-old Leonard Dyke, and she thought the sketch looked just like him. Leonard had gone camping a few days before, something he did a lot, and up until the evening of July 18th, he had been texting Helen and his children constantly, but she hadn't heard from him since then. Although DNA testing needed to be carried out, they now felt strongly that this was the man. Leonard was described as a caring husband, attentive father, and a cherished lecturer teaching botany at the University of British Columbia. His students loved him and found him fascinating, saying his passion for teaching and how much he loved what he spoke about inspired them to want to learn more. He had a dry and witty sense of humor that kept everyone entertained. And as well as his job, he enjoyed drawing, writing short plays and poems, playing guitar, and of course the great outdoors. Despite the fact he was often presenting to huge groups at a time, his family said he could be surprisingly quiet and very private. Hence the reason he loved his solo camping trip so much. He had just celebrated his 64th birthday, and on July 16th he had packed up a small camping stove, some food and a tent, and had driven off in his Toyota RAV4. Excited to explore more and learn as he went, he told his wife he wanted to find and photograph some grizzlies and teach himself about the wildlife. On July 21st, some CCTV from Meadow Lake, Saskatchewan came in, and this would change everything. Cameras had picked up none other than a gray 2011 Toyota RAV4, and inside of the car was Cam McLeod and Briar Schmigalski, the 2 missing teenagers. More footage showed Cam and Briar buying some black tape, which they put over parts of the car, seemingly in an attempt to disguise it in some way. Although, of course, this didn't work. It was quite clearly Leonard's car. A few days later, with it now safe to do so, a proper search of the burnt-out camper van was carried out. Officers found rounds of ammunition that matched what was found at both crime scenes. Just after this, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police issued a bombshell statement that the public had not been expecting. The 2 teens that everyone was out looking for, praying to find them safe and well, were actually the suspected killers of China, Lucas, and Leonard. Cam had a possession and acquisition license, and before they had left Vancouver, Ireland, they had purchased an SKS semi-automatic rifle and 20 rounds of ammunition. It turned out that just before the press release announcing that the pair were now wanted, Cam and Briar had actually been stopped by First Nation safety officers doing a routine alcohol check in Split Lake, Manitoba. With no alcohol found on them, they were let go and sent on their way. The The safety officers had no idea the announcement that was to come. And by the skin of their teeth, the teens had narrowly evaded being caught and detained. Where they were now was anyone's guess. A day later, on July 23rd, a local man called Billy Beardy and his wife Tamara actually located the Great Toyota near Lake Cree Nation, north of a place called Gillam in Manitoba. This vehicle was also on fire, just burning away in the woods. Next to the car were some half-eaten pork chops, pots and pans, orange peels, keys, matches, and various tools. As suspected, the car's number plate was linked to Leonard Dyke, and DNA tests soon confirmed, just as his wife Helen had feared, Leonard was most definitely the third victim. 2 days later, arrest warrants were issued for the two and named as official suspects in the deaths of China and Lucas as well. The search for the pair, which had actually started almost 2,000 miles away across 3 provinces, suddenly descended on the small town of Gillam, close to where Ernest's car had been found by Billy and Tamara. Gillam has a population of less than 1,500 people and only one road going in and out. It was here that the police set up their base. The whole area was put on lockdown and officers told residents to be wary, to keep their doors locked day and night, and to only leave the house if necessary. Search parties also found out into the surrounding areas, combing through everything as meticulously as possible. Alan, Breyer's father, then heard on the news that not only was his son missing, but he was actually a suspect in a string of awful crimes. My heart just sank. I told myself there's a mistake, there's got to be a mistake, he recalled. Cam's girlfriend then contacted the police and told them that he had sent her a text message on July 13th, telling her he would not be returning home. It was a very cryptic and unexpected message. The police presence in Gillam was immense, and they felt strongly that without a vehicle and with the whole world now watching, they were probably in this area and laying low. The mayor said the town had gone from seeing maybe 2 or 3 police officers over a couple of days to 100 patrolling the streets morning, noon, and night. Billy said it was tough to see so much police presence there when the car had been found in Fox Lake Cree Nation. His small and scared community didn't even have working street lights, let alone the authorities' support. At the end of July, however, police announced that they were pulling a lot of the resources that were going into the hunt, calling it a phased withdrawal. By this point, the search had been going on for about a week. Police had searched almost 4,000 square miles, followed up on over 1,000 tips, knocked on over 500 doors, including those of the teens' parents, and had even been working with the military. There were drones, helicopters, crisis negotiators, dogs, and hundreds of people involved in the searches. Alan said he believed his son was in a lot of pain mentally and wanted to die in a confrontation with the police. They're going to go out in a blaze of glory. Trust me on this, that's what they're going to do, he said. The families of both teens were begging them to come home and turn themselves in so they could deal with whatever had happened together. Just as resources and teams started being pulled, police got 2 more tips. Some members of the Bear Clan Patrol of First Nations Neighborhood Watch Group said they had spotted whom they described as 2 tall, slender individuals digging around near a landfill before they ran away into the woods. But this was in York Landing, almost 80 miles away from where everyone was looking. The mayor of Gilliam said that if they had actually made it all the way there, he was almost impressed, as it would be pretty impossible to do without being caught. But after looking, police said they couldn't substantiate this claim. Billy Beardy was now involved with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in a big way, and was almost spearheading the searches, guiding them on where to go and leading the way. When authorities realized just how knowledgeable Billy was when it came to the area and the terrain, they knew they had to use it. The team started going back along the Nelson River by boat, and it was here that they found Cam's backpack with a box of ammunition inside along with his wallet and some clothes. They also located a toiletry bag belonging to Leonard and a sleeping bag. Billy pointed out that the water was so fast moving and there were so many swells. These items definitely hadn't just washed up there. They had been dumped there, indicating that the pair were still on foot, but likely slowing down and struggling. They were clearly getting rid of excess weight and baggage as they were becoming more tired and hungry, fighting a tough terrain that was teeming with insects and bears and filled with swampy areas that you could sink into very quickly. All this only being exacerbated by the sweltering heat. Billy said that if you went into some parts without any help or knowledge, The land would not forgive you and it could prove fatal. Some parts were so inhospitable and treacherous even the locals wouldn't dream of venturing out. It is really hard to comprehend just how expansive, dense and dark so much of this area is. And although police admitted it was simply not possible to get the manpower to search every single part of it, they did seem to be closing in on them given the clues they were finding. On August 2nd, as helicopters and drones slowly flew back over the Nelson River, a small and damaged boat was spotted along the shoreline. The teens' families were still praying they would turn themselves in and be found safely, with Cam's dad saying, "We try to wrap our heads around what is happening and hope that Cam will come home to us safely, so we can all get to the bottom of the story." But Alan said he was now coming to terms with the situation at hand. Billy was still in charge of operating the jet boats, and with a team of Royal Canadian Mounted Police on board, they went down the river for a final time. Whilst out in the water, Billy spotted a raven jump in a riverside ravine. This caught his attention immediately as he knew this indicated some sort of carcass had to be around for it to be feeding on. "Any kind of bushman knows that if there's a raven there, he's eating something," he said. Billy knew in his gut that they needed to focus more of their attention in this exact area. And on August 7th, 2019, exactly where Billy stopped the boat and saw the raven, authorities found two bodies. Near the creek, just off from the Nelson River, among some bushes, were the bodies of 19-year-old Cam McLeod and 18-year-old Briash Migelski. Almost 2,000 miles from where it had all started on the highway, the hunt had finally come to an end. Billy then spent the next 13 hours going back and forth, bringing all the police and experts in and out by boat. Officers admitted they really would have been lost without him. The medical examiner couldn't exactly say when the pair had died, but they determined that Cam had shot Briar before shooting himself in what they believe was a pact. Next to Cam's body was one of the rifles, and the other was still loosely in his grasp. A digital camera actually belonging to Leonard was also found nearby. It had 6 videos and 3 images on it, which included one of Briar posing with one of the semi-automatic rifles and a selfie of Cam. In the first video, both teens took responsibility for all 3 murders, but gave no motive as to why they had done it. In the second video, Briar talks to the camera and explains that they have reached the Nelson River, intending to take the boat out and flee. But because the current was so strong, he said they may have to kill themselves. Cam agreed. And in the third video, they seemed to change their mind and said they planned to kill more people by taking the boat and going to Europe or Africa and carrying on their killing spree there. The other videos, however, went back to their plans to take their own lives and expressing their desire to be cremated if they were found. Police described the videos as cold, remorseless, and matter-of-fact. Briar's father, Alan, said he wanted to see the videos for himself and said he just couldn't believe that this had all happened. Police said it didn't appear that either one of them was the driving force or the ringleader. It seemed they were both equal and willing partners in everything they were doing. Despite the public and media asking questions, and Alan asking to see the tapes, detectives have never released them. They believe that Cam and Brian may have made the videos for notoriety, and releasing them would be seen as an insult to the victims. According to sources, there were some red flags. Friends said that Briar was obsessed with Hitler and the Third Reich and purchased lots of memorabilia. He also had a fascination with guns from a young age. Alan said although this had left him deeply upset and riddled with guilt, he also recognized that his son needed professional help. He described Briar's early life as troubled, and when Alan and his wife Deborah had divorced, this had affected his son a lot. He recalled that he took solace in YouTube and video games, seldom communicating or sharing his feelings, becoming slowly more and more introverted. Briar would often say to his friends when playing shooting games, "What if this was real? Can you imagine if this was real?" Getting very excited about this idea in a way his friends never were and found odd. Cam's family said they couldn't believe this was the quiet, polite, and kind young man they all knew. Helen, Leonard's wife, said, "The families should not feel guilt for the way they raise their boys. It has nothing to do with that. It's those boys' decision to take lives. And why they decided to do that, it isn't important. What's important was that they did it. And I feel they'll face the consequences of that. I think they did at the end." For nearly 3 weeks over the summer of 2019, what would be one of Canada's largest nationwide manhunts had gripped not only the locals, but the rest of the world as well. An extensive search covering thousands of miles that ended just as mysteriously as it had started. With no motive, no reason, no answers, and no closure for anyone. No one will ever know how everyone happened to come into contact with each other, and what took place when they did. Billy Beardy, who had been so vital in helping bring this case to a conclusion, would later be honored by the Keewatin Tribal Council for his contribution to the search efforts, with people calling him a pillar of the community. He was presented with a star blanket and an eagle feather. Every patch on the quilt represents a person, and it means you are surrounded by those who love, support, and will protect you. Billy's wife said she was so proud of him, but was sad that he hadn't been treated like one of the team. He had been out there day in, day out with no protection, safety gear, or life jacket, and he could very easily have lost his life in trying to help. The lead investigator acknowledged this and apologized. In October 2019, Billy was elected chief of Fox Lake Cree Nation, and was also later honored by the Gillam Royal Canadian Mounted Police. One has to wonder if he hadn't spotted the Raven, recognized what it meant, and turned the boat back around, how much longer the search for the teens would have gone on for, and if they would ever have been found at all. It is a senseless case that still grips people to this day, and one that will leave everyone guessing and clutching at nothing but speculative thoughts and ideas. The Assistant Commissioner Kevin Hackett said it was one of the most dynamic and unpredictable cases in his memory, which brings today's episode to somewhat of a conclusion. Doris, Leonard's sister, said if there was anything positive to come out of her brother's death, it would be all the people coming forward to speak about how much he had impacted their lives. She took comfort in that, even though she knew the ever-private and humble Leonard would have hated every bit of the attention. China's mom, Sheila, said she would look at the CCTV of them in the gas station all the time. I watched that video over and over. I kept seeing new things and watching that embrace that they had. I could hear them saying, "Let's do this, here we go," saying it was their purpose to travel the world together, and what they had seen and done at such a young age was remarkable. The families, friends, and loved ones of China, Lucas, and Leonard described the loss as profound. They hoped that everyone will remember them for the kind, giving, and adventurous way in which they loved to live, and not for the awful ways in which their lives so cruelly came to an end. Eric Lee Franks was born in North Carolina in September of 1972 and spent much of his childhood in East Tennessee, where his father was a pastor. He was an active and popular child who had many friends throughout his years in school. When he was 19, Eric met a woman named Kendra Firmingham who worked with his mother at a mall in Nashville, Tennessee. They began dating, and Eric fell deeply in love with her. He was therefore heartbroken when Kendra later left him to move to Michigan to get back together with an old boyfriend. She cut off all communication with Eric, and he would tell friends for years that he blamed himself for the relationship ending and considered Kendra to be the one that got away. Eric did eventually move on, marrying a woman named Gail while he was living in Tupelo, Mississippi. Gail had a young son when Eric met her, and Eric loved the little boy like he was his own son. Eric was happy to have a family of his own and the stability it provided him. Unfortunately, this happy period of his life would not last long, and several areas of his life would soon begin to fall apart. In 2006, Eric's father passed away, and Eric was devastated by the loss. Then in 2008, following the economic recession, Eric lost his job as a maintenance worker at a shopping mall and could not find new employment anywhere in Tupelo. He decided to move his family to Ohio, where his mother and sister were living, both to be able to spend more time with them and to find new opportunities for work. Eric was able to work in Ohio, but not consistently. The financial stress this caused created more tension in his marriage, which was already strained by this point. Unhappy with his romantic relationship, Eric began focusing on finding comfort in old friendships. He began using Facebook to locate and reconnect with friends he had lost contact with. In addition to old friends, Eric also tried to locate his former girlfriend, Kendra, whom he had not seen in over 15 years. He initially could not find her on Facebook, later learning that she used an alias for her Facebook profile, but did find John, the old boyfriend she had moved to Michigan to be with. Eric sent him a message, asking him if he knew how to get in contact with Kendra. When John wrote back, He informed Eric that he and Kendra were married and had 2 daughters. He said he would let his wife know that Eric wanted to catch up with her and let her decide if she wanted to speak with him. Kendra ultimately did choose to begin speaking with Eric. Then one day, Eric saw a post about Kendra's 2 daughters on Facebook that included their dates of birth. He noticed that Kendra's older daughter, Emily, had been born less than 9 months after he and Kendra had broken up. When he asked Kendra about Emily's parentage, she confirmed that Emily was his daughter. While the news that he had a teenage daughter was of course a huge surprise, Eric's mother has stated that he was never so happy as he was when he found out about Emily. Eric was adopted, and while his parents loved him just as much as their daughter, who was their biological child, and never treated him any differently, Eric had never known what it was like to have a biological relative in his life. Furthermore, he and his wife had separated within weeks of him learning about Emily, meaning he no longer had his stepson in his life. He felt lonely following his separation and was excited to create a relationship with his newly discovered daughter. On October 25, 2010, 38-year-old Eric made the drive from Ohio to Saginaw, Michigan in a bronze 2001 Chevrolet Malibu owned by his mother that she had given him permission to use. He initially planned to just be making an extended visit to Michigan and rented a room in Miller's Motel in Bridgeport Township. To support himself, he would use a temp agency to find work every day and perform odd jobs for the owner of the motel. Kendra did allow Eric to meet Emily and spend time with her once a week, but Emily was not immediately told that Eric was her father. Eric was just happy to be able to see her. Things gradually became even better for Eric in Michigan, and he wanted to make his visit there more permanent. Eventually, Emily was told who he really was. Furthermore, Eric told his loved ones that he and Kendra were rekindling their relationship and that she would be leaving her husband so that she, Eric, and Emily could all move into a home together as a family. On March 10, 2011, Eric spoke with his mother Joanne on the phone. He told her that he was moving into a house across town where cell phone reception was poor, so it would be more difficult for him to keep in touch with her. He also told her to look forward to July when he had to return to Ohio for an important dentist appointment that he had already paid for because he was going to bring Emily with him so that she could meet her. This would be the last time Joanne would speak with her son. Over the following few months, Joanne could not reach Eric by phone. She was not immediately concerned because he had warned her he was moving somewhere with poor cell reception, and she would receive emails from his account in response to the voicemails she would leave him. However, she became concerned when Eric failed to make his planned trip to Ohio in July and missed his dentist appointment. By this point, she was also more concerned by the fact that her son was communicating exclusively through email with her, and it had been months since she had actually heard his voice. Joanne's sister Deborah then helped her track down Kendra online to ask her about Eric's whereabouts. Kendra claimed to have not seen Eric since the middle of April. They had gotten into an argument, and Eric had spent several days waiting outside of her home, calling and texting her in an effort to get her to come out and speak with him. When she refused to have a conversation with him, he told her that he was leaving to go to California to find another one of his former girlfriends. Eric moving to California did make some degree of sense. Ever since he was a child, Eric had dreamed of working in film production, either as a director or a screenwriter. As an adult, he had tried to live in California and break into the industry 4 separate times. However, he could not afford the high cost of living there and would have to leave the state. However, if Eric had left the area with poor cell reception, he would have been able to call his family. And his mother had been receiving emails from his account, but none of them mentioned this major move. By November, even the suspicious emails stopped coming, and Joanne reported Eric missing to her local police department, who coordinated with authorities in Michigan. 6 days later, Joanne received an email from Eric's, but it made her even more convinced that the messages were not actually from her son. It included a new phone number, but the number was from a prepaid cell that was never set up. Later investigative efforts would show that the email had been sent using the public Wi-Fi at a Burger King in Michigan. When authorities in Michigan spoke with Kendra, she told them that she had never had any plans to leave her husband to move in with Eric as he had told his friends and family. She also said that she had not seen Eric since March when she helped him pack up his things from his motel room before he left for California. This contradicted her earlier story to Eric's aunt, in which she claimed she last saw Eric at her home in April. The owner of the motel where Eric had been staying further contradicted Kendra's accounts of the time around Eric's disappearance. He had last seen Eric on March 14th when he paid him in advance for the next week of his stay. A week later, he had seen Kendra emptying Eric's belongings out of his room and putting them into her own car. When he confronted Kendra, she told him that Eric had taken off and that she was just getting his things out of the motel room for him. On April 5th, almost a month after Eric last spoke with his mother, and while numerous incoming calls to him were going unanswered, his phone had begun making outgoing calls again. It had been used to call several salvage yards as well as a dental office where Kendra was a patient. Kendra told authorities that she had never used Eric's cell phone call her dentist. The records on the phone show that the phone never left the Saginaw area in the months after Eric's family last heard from him, contradicting Kendra's claims that he had taken off for California. 3 months after speaking with authorities about Eric's disappearance, Kendra and John moved to Florida with Emily and the daughter they shared. However, while they were physically removed from the investigation, they would continue to be tied to it. Eric's family remained dedicated to searching for him and kept focus on his case through social media, missing person flyers, media appearances, and conferences. Their efforts did result in new clues. In 2012, they were able to reach a man who had stayed next door to Eric at the motel. After hearing details about the disappearance from Eric's family, he went to the police to report an incident in which Kendra's husband John, who had told authorities he had never met Eric in person, drove up to the motel and screamed violent threats at Eric. The case was eventually transferred to the Michigan State Police, who searched the property surrounding the home Kendra and John had lived in with cadaver dogs in May of 2013. They did not locate anything during the search. Kendra died of breast cancer in 2016. Following her death, John provided authorities with the names of 2 men she had known back in Michigan to investigate. In 2018, a criminal justice student in California had seen Eric's story featured in an episode of the investigation Discovery series Disappeared that had been released the year before and began following the case. She worked at an automotive repair shop and had the idea to track the car Eric had been driving through Carfax. The vehicle also went missing around the time of Eric's disappearance and had never been found. Investigators and Eric's family had assumed that the car had most likely been scrapped, driven into a body of water, or somehow otherwise been hidden or destroyed. Authorities had run previous checks on the car's vehicle identification number, but without success. When the student initially looked up the vehicle using its vehicle identification number, she also initially found no new information. However, in September of 2020, Carfax sent her an email service notification that the car had received an oil change on August 31st in Clare, Michigan. She notified Eric's mother, Joanne, of the activity on the car's report. The vehicle was located and confirmed to be the correct vehicle and then taken to the Michigan State Police Crime Lab for examination. It had recently been sold at an estate sale after being found in the garage of a man named Gerald Rutledge. Gerald had died in April of 2020 at the age of 84. He worked as an hourly worker at General Motors, but presumably because he had no children and lived frugally in his modest West Side Saginaw home, he left behind an estate worth $2,700,000 per his will. Following his death, the money was to be split between the Saginaw chapter of the American Red Cross, the Saginaw Police Department, and the Saginaw Fire Department. Gerald suffered from dementia later in life, which left him legally he required a caretaker, and at one time, his caretaker had been Kendra Firmingham. In the weeks before Eric disappeared, concerns were raised about Gerald's finances. He had paid the home healthcare service Kendra owned a full year in advance for his care, which was not standard practice. Gerald's assets were frozen for a time following this discovery. Based on the condition of the exterior of the car, it appears as though it had been stored inside of the garage for some time. Gerald's neighbors do not believe that he was aware that the car was in his garage and furthermore claim that he would have been upset had he known it was there. After Eric's brother-in-law, Chad Boss, went to Michigan to inspect the car, he told MLive that there had been stains on the passenger side seat and floorboard that could have been from blood. The man who had purchased the car at the estate sale was in the business of purchasing expensive vehicles to help low-income clients and had previous experience with vehicles which were known to have contained a deceased person. He told Chad Boss that the car had the characteristic smell such cars had when he purchased it, and he also believed that the stains had been from blood. Part of the concrete floor in the garage where the car had been stored looked as though it had been disturbed. So a portion of the floor was cut up and cadaver dogs were brought into the scene, but Eric's remains were not found. The inside of the home was also searched. The new owner of Gerald's home discovered a brochure on his property that indicated that a high-powered incinerator had previously been installed in his basement but removed from the property for the estate sale and notified the state police of that information. While the discovery of the car appears to strengthen the connection between Kendra Framingham and Eric's disappearance, there are still many unanswered questions in the case. Most importantly, where Eric is. His family believes that he was murdered at the time of his disappearance, but they still hope to be able to one day locate his remains and give him a proper burial. I have prayed for answers for years, but didn't know if they were going to get answered, Chad Boss told ABC 12 News following the discovery of the car. I was getting used to the idea that we might never know. This certainly gives us a hope that we might get to know what happened for real, what happened to Eric, instead of our theories on what happened to Eric. 25-year-old Benilyn Aquino, known as Benny Lynn, was originally from the Philippines. She was incredibly popular, down-to-earth, and dearly loved, with her sister Shella saying that she couldn't think of anyone who didn't like her. Benny Lynn was determined to pursue her education, and with the support of her family, including her father, Benedicto, and her sister, who worked to support her, she managed to graduate. She was described as intelligent, kind, beautiful, and dependable. Benny Lynn had a deep love for her family, and her brother recalled how she would always protect him from bullies. In 2015, she met a British man named Lexington Burke on a dating website. Their romance flourished, and after visiting the Philippines, the couple married in a grand ceremony in Samar on July 28, 2018. A month later, on August 19th, they welcomed their first child, a baby girl named Jellica. The family planned to relocate to the United Kingdom on Jellica's first birthday. It was Benny Lynn's first time leaving the Philippines, and she was hopeful for a bright future in the UK. She worked hard and sent money back to support her family in the Philippines. Sadly, by the end of 2020, her marriage had begun to deteriorate, leading Benny Lynn to move into emergency accommodation, a first-floor flat in Kingswood, 3 miles outside of Bristol. There, she formed friendships, including with the Moms in Bath group, who helped her with food and other essentials. Friends and members of the group frequently visited her, eager to offer their support and show her as much love as possible. Even though their marriage had broken down, the couple had agreed to custody arrangements for Jellica. Towards the end of February 2021, Lexington had made several attempts to contact Benny Lynn, but he got no response. She wasn't replying to his text messages or answering his calls. He had posted a note through her letterbox, but this too had gone unanswered. The social work department had also contacted him to see if he had heard from her, as they had been unable to reach her and she had missed an appointment. This was totally out of character, and as he reached a point of extreme concern, he contacted the police, and Benny Lynn, Jellica, and another child who was 7 years old were reported missing on the March 1st. It's important to note here that information on this case refers to the 7-year-old girl, but other news sources would later state that this was Benny Lynn's eldest daughter. No name or information has been given, as she cannot be legally identified, and all steps must be taken to protect her identity. She will be referred to throughout this episode as Jane Doe. Avon and Somerset police launched an investigation and quickly uncovered a lead. A car had been traced driving into Gloucestershire around the time they had last been seen, before being driven back up north and over the border into Scotland. The driver was seen on CCTV filling up his car in a petrol station. The investigators reached out to the Scottish police for their assistance in finding the vehicle. The car was registered to a man called Andrew Innis, who had traveled down from Dundee to pick them up. Despite the time zone difference between the Philippines and the United Kingdom, Shella and Benny Lynn always found time to talk to each other and were in regular contact. Before the three of them had gone missing on Thursday, February 18th, Benny Lynn had been talking to her sister on a video call. Benny Lynn was in Andrew's car and they were all driving up to Scotland. Shella asked if she could see him, and Benny Lynn flipped the camera around and showed the man driving the car. There were no overnight bags. It was clear that this was not meant to be a long trip. A couple of days after she had arrived in Scotland, Scheller had become concerned, as Benelin was no longer replying to her messages. On Saturday, February 20th, she sent Andrew 2 messages, knowing that Benelin was with him. "Hi. Hello, sir. What happened to my sister?" The following day, she received a reply. "It's a little bit long story, but don't worry. She's perfectly fine." Scheller messaged back, "What happened to my sister, sir? Please tell me." Andrew responded, "I met her on a dating website and we chatted for a long time. Then I went down to visit her." "Where is she now?" Scheller asked. "She's in Glasgow. She didn't tell me her whole story before. I only found out last weekend. I thought she was divorced already, but it seems she wasn't 100% honest with me about that." He said he had dropped them at a cafe in Glasgow with another man she had met online, someone that he didn't know. He said that Benny Lynn had wanted to hide away at his property as Lexington wanted custody of Jellica and wanted Benny Lynn thrown out of the country. He told Shelley that Benny Lynn was safe and that he had advised her to discard her phone if she wanted to get away from the authorities. Skila begged to speak with Benny Lynn. He replied, "I expect she will get in touch with you once she gets settled down." Several more messages went back and forth. Skila said, "Sir, can you tell me my sister is alive?" Andrew replied, "Scotland is a very peaceful country. We don't have much crime at all. Please try not to worry. I'm sure your sister is perfectly safe." For days later, Scheller had reached out to him again. He told her that the other gentleman from the cafe had messaged him to say they were settling into their new routine very well, adding, "She's happy to have found someone nice and desperately relieved that her baby won't be taken away from her." Andrew said he wished to draw a line under this and said that he would wipe his technology, not just to protect myself but also to protect her so the police can't find her if they search my house. Scheller had asked him to send a video of Benny Lynn to prove that she was safe, and he sent her one. She said, "I hope we can chat again, sir." He messaged back, "Maybe one day we can, once the dust has all settled." The video he had sent of her to Scheller was an old one. At 3:20 p.m. on March 5th, police officers were dispatched to 21 Troon Avenue. This was the address the car had been registered to, home to 50-year-old Andrew Innis. The car was parked outside and there was also a skip containing various items, including mattresses and debris. After knocking on the door, Andrew Innis opened it but only slightly and they spoke to him on the doorstep. He refused to allow the officers into his house, saying that he was self-isolating and his daughter had just come out of the bath and needed to put some clothes on. The officers saw Jane Doe, who was fully clothed, inside the house through a crack in the door. They had a bad feeling and knew something was wrong. They insisted he let them inside. Upon entering the house, they described this as being in a state of disarray. It was seemingly under renovation. Kitchen utensils were on the stairs and the cooker and units in the kitchen had all been removed. In the living room was Jane Doe, who was watching cartoons. One of the officers spoke to her. She confirmed that Andrew was not her father and they were of no relation to each other. When questioned, Andrew Innis said he had driven Benelin and Angelica to Glasgow and left them at a cafe with a man he didn't know. He said he hadn't seen them since. They didn't believe the story he was telling and they knew they needed to dig deeper for the truth. What came out of his mouth next would leave the officers stunned. "Killed her. She's under the floor. We got into a fight and I killed her. But where was Jellica? Under the floor with her mom. I couldn't look after a child. The child was screaming," he said. Upon this shocking confession, Andrew Innis was arrested and taken into custody. Jane Doe was also taken away to safety. The following day, on March 6th, he was charged with the murder of Benny Lynn and Jellica, and the police now needed to find their bodies. When news of the appalling crime began to break and spread, the local residents left flowers and toys in tribute to Benny Lynn and Jellica outside of Tryon Avenue. As the hunt for the bodies continued, the police began to piece together the chain of events. Benny Lynn had been using a dating website called Filipino Cupid as she was seeking companionship. It was here that she met 50-year-old Andrew Innis. The messages had initially just been general chit-chat and had then moved into video calls. He started to steer the conversation in a different direction. He asked her to send a photograph of herself that was sexual in nature, but she refused. He offered her a job as a community relations manager and money to work for him. He would also give her somewhere to stay, to which she replied, "If you want to employ me, I can do this in Bristol." On February 12th, the pair had agreed to meet up. After they had arranged the meeting, Andrew Innis had made several internet searches for the murder rates in Scotland, as well as what is chloroform used for and underfloor storage. In spite of the strict travel restrictions that were in place due to COVID-19, he had traveled down from Dundee to England to meet her in Kingswood, a distance of more than 400 miles. She had taken pity on him sleeping in his car as he couldn't get into a hotel, and he wasn't allowed to stay in her accommodation. She had wanted to see Scotland and the beauty it had to offer, so she agreed to go with him and stay at his for the weekend. Various photographs were taken of Benelin and Angelica in Dundee as they saw the sights and explored the city, as well as photographs of Andrew Innis. On February 23rd, he was seen purchasing gravel and DIY tools. And the next day, a skip turned up at the house. The task in front of the officers was massive. They called upon the assistance of forensics teams alongside anthropologists, archaeologists, and geologists to ascertain if what he was saying had actually been true. It would take 2 weeks for the police to excavate the house, but they would come to discover that Andrew Innis had not been lying. Buried roughly 3 feet down, the bodies of Jellica and Benny Lynn were found on the March 19th. Back in the Philippines, Shella received a call. It was from Benny Lynn's estranged husband, Lexington. She could not believe what she was hearing, and she was tasked with giving the news to her parents, who were living in a different part of the country. Completely traumatized by the death of her sister and niece, she was left unable to sleep and kept trying to contact Benny Lynn on Messenger. Benny Lynn's devastated brother posted to social media, "We miss you so much since you left the Philippines, sis. I remember we used to play and you made me dance. You always made us happy. We will never forget you." As the police continued to look into Andrew Innis, they discovered that this software developer had no previous criminal convictions. He had been born in Germany on a military base in 1970. He had moved to Dundee from Derby at the age of 24 and had worked with DMA Design on various video games after attending the University of Aberdeen. He would later marry a woman from Japan and moved out there with her. The couple shared 3 children and also lived in California for a while before going back to Scotland once more. In 2019, their marriage had fallen apart and he had been deported from Japan back to the UK, away from his wife and children. Andrew Innis was on 34 dating websites, and there were more disturbing discoveries. He was very experienced with technology and designed and built what was referred to as a scraper tool that could be bolted onto various websites. This meant he could only have women with young children included in the searches he was making on these sites. He harvested the data and put it into a spreadsheet where women were graded based on age, weight, height, and whether or not they were mothers to young children. The profiles he had given the highest scores to were women with young children who were in their mid to late 20s. Now that the bodies of Benil and Angelica were found, it was time for a post-mortem to be carried out. This would reveal the horrifying truth. Benny Lynn suffered major head injuries and internal bleeding. She had also been stabbed in the chest. It is believed she was murdered on February 23rd, the same day he was seen on CCTV buying DIY tools and gravel. Detective Constable Paul Hardy asked Innis how long she had been buried under the floor. Innis replied, "Last Friday she came up. We were going to spend the weekend together. I saw she had been chatting to about 50 men on the phone. It was either Monday or Tuesday. Took me a while to get through the concrete." He was adamant it hadn't been planned though. He said, "There was a fight and she came at me and I fought back, and now she's dead. There was no premeditation. She came at me with a sushi knife." But CCTV would blow the story apart as he was shown in AB and Q hardware store on King's Cross Road in Dundee, where he purchased the hammer that he would use to bludgeon her to death. He said that he had killed her in self-defense, fearing for his life. But his story would later change, saying he had suffered an auditory hallucination. It is believed that this is how Benelin's death had actually occurred. As she stood in the kitchen making food, He attacked her, bludgeoning her repeatedly in the head with the hammer. He then went to his office to get a long-bladed knife that Innis had described as a samurai sword before heading back into the kitchen and stabbing her with it. He had also bludgeoned her with the handle of the blade and again with the hammer. All of this had happened in front of 7-year-old Jane Doe. He proceeded to wrap up her dead body in a rubble sack, tarpaulin, and a blanket before putting her under the kitchen floor. Following the murder of Benny Lynn over the next 2 to 3 days, he had kept Angelica alive and sexually abused her. He would then murder her by applying pressure to her neck and mouth. He wrapped up her naked body in rubble sacks and put her with her mother under the kitchen floor. He said that she had wanted her mother, and it seemed logical to me to put her with her mom. His DNA was also found on her body, and DNA belonging to both Angelica and Innis was found on a condom in a bin at the house. Following the murders, he had told Jane Doe that Benelin and Angelica were in hospital and that was why they weren't there. Officers who interviewed him said he was wallowing in self-pity and showed no remorse for his dreadful crimes. The investigator spoke to Jane Doe. She explained that Andrew Innis had what she called a heavy hammer and that he had put it in Benny Lynn's head. She said, "I tried to call the police. I couldn't speak." She said they had been playing a game of hide and seek when Angelica was murdered by Innis. She said, "I don't know where. I just know looking in the bathroom and he shut the door on me. Andrew shut the door at me, so it must be in the bathroom. I should have saved them, but I couldn't because I didn't know what was happening." During her time at the house, she was subjected to an appalling series of rape and sexual assaults. She said that after the assaults, where she would be handcuffed and gagged, he would give her money, on one occasion giving her £2.10. She described being held captive by him. Andrew put a rope on the door and attached it to the other door, and I couldn't open it. Andrew would open it when he came back. I told him, "I want to go with you because that was my chance to get out." Andrew denied the allegations of sexual abuse against Jane Doe when he had been arrested. And during an interview on March 5th, he said, "I never touched the girl." But DNA would later be his undoing. DNA evidence was found on clothing and handcuffs. Jane Doe had also tested positive for chlamydia. Andrew Innis had chlamydia. Andrew Innis' trial began at the High Court in Edinburgh on the January 31st, 2023, with Judge Lord Beckett presiding. Andrew admitted that he had killed Angelica and Benny Lynn, but denied murder and argued a defense of diminished responsibility. He had also denied charges of attempting to defeat the ends of justice and rape. On the third day of his trial, he changed his story again. He now said that he had become what he called apocalyptically angry after thinking that Benny Lynn resembled both his former partner and estranged wife. He said that from the neck down she looked like his estranged wife, and from the head up like the former partner. He said his former partner had left him in the most horrible way, dumping him through a text message, and that he thought of all the nasty things my wife had done to me and I got angry. The way she treated me, I was furious. I started to think some crazy things. I remember the blade going in once. She was lying on the floor and I was just hitting her until she stopped moving. In his testimony, he said that the killings had not been planned, saying if this was premeditated in any way it would have been cleaner, adding that the hammer he had purchased was not a useful weapon. He said it's ridiculous that I had returned with a hammer when I went out for petrol. Innis told the court that he was able to remember the initial strike and struggle that ensued in the kitchen before it moved out into the living room. He said it was an anger I have never experienced before in my entire life. When asked in his cross-examination what he had done with the bodies, he replied, "I dug them a respectable grave and gave them a Christian burial and then replaced the floor. That's all I did." His original plan had been to bury them at sea, but instead decided to conceal their bodies under his kitchen floor as he was already in the process of refurbishing the room. It was obvious that he had a deeply controlling nature when he admitted he had been seriously angry when his former wife had got a new haircut that he didn't approve of. He also said he had attempted to castrate himself with an electrical cord. There were moments when Innis would break down in the witness box and cry while speaking. A huge part of the trial focused on his state of mind. Psychiatrist Dr. Gordon Cowan, who specializes in forensic psychiatry, had met with Innis 8 times following his arrest and gave evidence on the 4th day of the trial. He explained that Innis' story had undergone multiple variations and changes, saying it had initially been self-defense, Then he had been suffering with auditory hallucinations, and finally a combination of both. Dr. Cowan said, "It's clear he held resentment towards his ex-partners, and this lady in front of him in some way reminded him of these ladies, and he became angry, uncontrollably angry at her." He explained to the jury he said he acted in self-defense from an attack. Then he spoke of an internal monologue with a voice of a kind of identity that was advising him to hurt the woman, and he was saying she's done nothing wrong. "It's really difficult to know for sure the symptoms, if any, Mr. Innis has at this time." Innis had been diagnosed with Crohn's disease, a condition that would lead to him being hospitalized in February of 2021 at Nine Wells Hospital on the outskirts of Dundee. He was prescribed steroids to help ease the symptoms. Defense lawyer Brian McConaughey asked Dr. Cowan if Innis could have been experiencing psychosis induced by steroid use, as Innis had said he was insane as a result of the steroids. He had been prescribed to take 40 milligrams a day, but the court heard he had taken an increased dose in the days before the murders. The fact that he had purchased the hammer from B and Q did not add up to this theory of psychosis. Dr. Cowan said that if someone was going through psychosis to the extent that they were going to commit murder, they would not be going about their day as usual with people not noticing. There's logic in his thought process, so I don't necessarily think it's indicative of somebody who is psychotic, he said. He emphasized that while it is a rare side effect of the medication, within the previous 12 months, no patient from NHS Tayside had experienced an episode of psychosis resulting from steroids, and the majority of his colleagues had never seen it over the course of their entire careers. Dr. Cowan met Innis in September 2021 in prison, and Innis had spoken to members of his family and become aware of steroid-induced psychosis. This was the first time he had become aware of this phenomenon and thought it perhaps fit with what happened to him, Dr. Cowan explained. Several of the professionals did consider that he had a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, but the judge later said that this neither predisposed him to violence nor that it gave any reduction on his culpability. One of the most heartbreaking moments of the trial came when the pre-recorded interview with Jane Doe was played. "Andrew killed Jellica when we were playing hide and seek," she said. She added that she didn't know what was happening. She also described the horrific sexual violence that she had been subjected to. The nature of the evidence was so distressing members of the jury were offered counseling to cope with what they had seen and listened to. On the charges relating to Jane Doe, Innis accused her of lying, saying that some parts of her story didn't add up. He argued he would not have used a sock to cover her mouth as she had said, as there were hundreds of other items more suitable. "If I wanted to gag that child, I would have used an actual gag," he said. Innis told the jury that had the police officers arrived at his home just 24 hours later, they could have found her murdered body alongside Benny Lynn and Jellica. After 5 days, the prosecution and defense rested their cases. Following the evidence that had been presented, Judge Lord Beckett gave instructions to the jury to find him guilty on both counts of murder. After just 2.5 hours of discussions, they returned their verdict. Andrew Innis was found guilty. Alongside his convictions of murder, he was also convicted of rape and sexual abuse. Andrew Innis was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 36 years that he must serve before he can even be considered for parole. Benny Lynn's family had traveled from the Philippines to the United Kingdom for the trial. They said in a statement that what had happened was the worst cruelty we could ever imagine, adding that they would be forever haunted by the appalling crimes. Benedicto, Benny Lynn's father, had had his life completely destroyed by the loss of his daughter and granddaughter. The grief was so devastating he had been left unable to work. For Lexington, what had happened to Benny Lynn and Jellica was devastating. He described his rage and pain at the cruelty that had been shown towards Angelica by Innis, and the appalling abuse and death she had suffered. It was later confirmed that Andrew Innis intended to appeal his conviction and sentence. His appeal was lodged at the High Court of Criminal Appeal in Edinburgh. The hearing will take place at a later date. No application for him to be released on bail pending his appeal was made, and he remains in prison. Jim Gamble, CEO of the Unique Safeguarding Group, who had also formerly led the Child Exploitation and Online Protection Organization, would say that it would be unusual for an offender like Innis if he did not have any previous victims. "I doubt they are his only victims. Some people won't realize how close they came to engaging with this awful person. We see that all the time. We see predators who target single mothers, not just to manipulate and coercively control them, but to gain access to young children. I think anyone that knows him, that knows of him, needs to reflect on what they know about him. I'm sure the police are doing exactly that. Police Scotland said they had contacted law enforcement in countries he was known to have gone to and had also collaborated with Interpol, but no other crimes had been uncovered. Benny Lynn's father said he cries every day and is struggling to come to terms with what happened. For me, I still haven't accepted that they're gone, he said. Her family also began campaigning for a charity called Kenlungan, which offers support and help to people from the Philippines who live in the United Kingdom, including those affected by domestic abuse and violence. Benedicto said, "I've now decided to dedicate my life to defend the rights of women and children. All Benny Lynn wanted was to love and be loved." She made the enormously brave decision to move away from her home to a country she didn't know, hoping for a bright future. To this day, Shella still calls her sister's phone just to hear her voice on the voicemail. She said that she will never forget either Benelin or Jellica, because they will be with her wherever she goes, adding, "I will always be with them." Jody Lumis was free-spirited, passionate, and outspoken, embodying the hippie ethos that many young adults embraced in the early 1970s. A talented artist, she had painted a mural of running horses on the walls of her bedroom. Jody was also a compassionate animal lover, rescuing and caring for injured creatures. She had a deep love for horseback riding and was devoted to her horse, Sadi, whom she cared for lovingly. In 1972, at 20 years old, Jody lived with her parents, John and Rosemary, her 12-year-old sister Jana, and her fiancé, Jim Roberts, in a house on Winsap Road, located between Mill Creek and Bothell, Washington. On the afternoon of August 23rd, she left home to go to the stable where her horse was boarded, 6 miles away. One of her parents would normally drive her to the stable, but today she decided to ride her white 10-speed bike there. Before Jody left home, her mother reminded her to take a dime with her so that she could call home from a payphone if she would be late returning. While Jody was an adult, Rosemary was obviously still concerned with her daughter's safety and preferred for her to return home before dark. Jody took the dime with her but never called home and did not arrive home as expected either. Rosemary began to worry, and that worry had turned to panic by 11 p.m. when there was a knock on her door. It was a detective who was there to notify the family that Jody had been sexually assaulted and murdered. Rosemary at the news, and John Lumis was too shocked to catch his wife before she fell to the floor. Jody had never arrived at her intended destination. After leaving home, she went to ask her friend and neighbor, Linda Hook, if she wanted to go riding with her. But Linda could not go because she was in the process of packing for an upcoming move to California. The last known person to see Jody before she was attacked was a 14-year-old girl selling apples at a fruit stand at the end of her family's driveway near Bothell Everett Highway in 164th Street Southeast, approximately halfway between Jody's home and the stable. The girl remembers seeing Jody because she was riding her bike while wearing boots and had stopped for an unusually long amount of time before passing through the intersection at Bothell Everett Highway and onto what was at the time called Penny Creek Road and is today known as Mill Creek Road. Jody would later be found on a dirt road off of Penny Creek Road. Around 5:30 p.m., 18-year-old Kathy Gogol and 33-year-old Walter Morris were driving through that wooded area trying to find somewhere to go target shooting when they came across a fallen tree that blocked their way. When Walter got out of the car, he discovered a young woman lying near the tree. She was mostly nude and had a serious head injury, which would later be determined to be from a gunshot wound. She was unable to talk but was still breathing. Walter was driving a small 2-seater Saab Sonnet and did not think he and Kathy could fit the woman in the car with them. So he initially suggested that Kathy stay with the woman while he went for help. However, Kathy, concerned both that whoever had harmed the young woman was still in the area and that the young woman's injuries were too severe to wait for him to leave and come back, insisted that they take the young woman to the hospital right then. They were somehow able to fit the young woman in the car with them. They did not take the time to try to redress the young woman given the serious nature of her injuries and their desire to get her to the hospital quickly. So Kathy did her best to cover up the young woman in the car so that other drivers on the road could not see her in her state of undress through the car window. Kathy and Walter were able to get the young woman, later identified as Jody Lumis, to the hospital by 5:45. Despite their efforts to get her help as quickly as possible, Jody was pronounced dead upon her arrival at the hospital. Jody had been killed by a .22 caliber gunshot to the right side of her head, just above her right ear. A subsequent medical review of her autopsy file theorized, based on the bullet's path, that Jody had been on the ground, trying to get her clothes back on after being raped when her killer had stood over her and shot her. Jody's bicycle was found in a ravine 180 feet away from where she was found, but the horse bridle she had taken with her that day was never located. Police performed interviews and followed up on leads for years after the murder, but ultimately the case went cold. In 2008, there was a new push to close the decades-old case. Jody was featured on the 10 of Hearts card in a deck of cold case playing cards. A set of cards, each featuring a photo and information about an unsolved case from Snohomish County, was created, and 5,000 decks of the cards were printed using funds from a donation from the Stillaguamish tribe. The decks were distributed to inmates in local county jails, as well as in the state prison complex, in hopes that inmates would recognize crimes they had heard other inmates discuss or take credit for and report what they had heard. Investigators also revisited the physical evidence in the case. Unfortunately, several important items, including the swabs taken at Jody's autopsy and the socks she had been wearing, had been lost over the years, potentially when the evidence was moved from the original room where it was stored into a newer facility. However, some of the evidence they still had would provide them with the lead that would ultimately close the case: the pair of St. Moritz ankle-high waffle stomper boots that Jody had been wearing when she was killed. The boots actually belonged to Jody's sister Jana, and she had borrowed them without asking, as Jana herself had gone horseback riding with a friend on the morning of August 23, 1972. Jody was not even 5 feet tall and had a very slight build, so she could still fit into the size 5.5 boots her 12-year-old sister had just gotten for the new school year. The Snohomish County Sheriff's Office had what physical evidence they still had, including the boots, sent to the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab to be re-examined. During the examination, a scientist noticed a tiny stain on the left boot. It turned out to be a semen stain, and DNA was extracted from the sperm it contained. Further testing was performed on the DNA in 2010 and 2011. The profile was compared to DNA samples provided by potential suspects and men living in the area surrounding the site where Jody was found. It was also run through criminal databases, but no match was found. In May of 2018, another Snohomish County cold case was solved when William Talbot II was arrested and charged with the 1987 murder of 18-year-old Tanya Van Kylenborg. The following month, he was also charged with the murder of her boyfriend, 20-year-old Jake Hook, who had disappeared with Tanya. Talbot was convicted of both murders in June of 2019. He had been identified using genetic genealogy, making Tanya and Jay's case the first in which the technique was used in successfully leading to a suspect being convicted in court. After identifying Talbot and arresting him, Snohomish County authorities began using the same technique in Jody's case, hoping that genetic genealogy would help identify her killer as well. In July of 2018, they sent the DNA profile to Parabon Nanolabs and began working with an Oregon-based genealogist to try to find relatives of the killer in public genealogy databases. After the DNA profile from the crime scene was uploaded into one such database, the genealogist identified individuals she believed to be third cousins of Jody's killer based on the amount of DNA they had in common. Through her research of their family history, she narrowed down her search until she determined that police were most likely looking for the son of a couple who lived in Edmonds, Washington. Unfortunately, that couple had 7 children, and 6 of them were sons. When authorities began investigating those sons, one of them did stand out as a likely suspect based on non-genetic factors. He had been living just 5 miles from where Jody was attacked and had been accused of various sexual crimes at least 5 times since the 1960s, but had never been convicted on charges stemming from them and received no punishment for them more serious than a citation for lewd conduct he had received in 1968. Authorities began investigating this man and surveilling him in hopes of surreptitiously collecting a sample of his DNA. On August 28, 2018, they observed him standing outside of the Tulalip Resort Casino, drinking a cup of coffee. When he threw the cup in the trash, they collected it and had it sent to the lab. The DNA extracted from that cup was a match to the DNA from the semen stain on the boot Jody had been wearing on the day she was killed. On April 10, 2019, 77-year-old Terrence Miller was arrested and charged with first-degree premeditated murder. Had married for the first time when he was 18 and his bride was just 14. Their 2-year marriage resulted in 2 daughters. Miller quickly remarried and had another daughter after their divorce. After his second marriage ended in divorce in 1967, he had married for a third time and had 2 more daughters. His third wife filed for divorce in 1974. He married his fourth wife in 1976, and this marriage finally lasted more than a handful of years. They were still married when Miller was arrested, selling ceramics out of the garage of their home in Edmonds. Miller had previously worked as a heavy machine operator. Authorities could find no connection between Miller and Jody Lumis. Miller's bail was set at $1 million on June 14, 2019. He was able to post it and was released. He worked with a bail company, which he paid $100,000, which he would never receive back, to secure his release. According to Snohomish County Sheriff's Office Detective Jim Scharf, this was the only time he could remember a defendant charged with first-degree murder being released in his 42-year career. Miller did have to wear an electronic monitoring device and was only allowed to leave his house for specific reasons like grocery shopping and doctor's appointments. Jody's loved ones were still horrified that the community would be put at risk by his release, and that he was allowed to be comfortable at home with his wife while awaiting trial when he had already had 47 years of freedom following the crime. Miller's trial had originally been set for June of 2019, but his attorneys had applied for and been granted a series of continuances so that they would have more time to prepare their case. In September of 2020, they requested that the court move the trial, which was now due to start the following month, until January of 2021, arguing that they had not had sufficient time to prepare for the trial. While Miller had been arrested a year and a half earlier, they claimed that the events of the previous several months had prevented them from properly preparing. As public defenders, they had dozens of clients and had spent much of the previous months working on emergency bail hearings for clients of theirs who needed to be released from custody because they were considered high risk for serious illness should they be exposed to COVID-19. They therefore now only had a month to interview 3 expert witnesses and 15 civilians they had not interviewed between Miller's arrest in April 2019 and the start of the pandemic, which they argued was an impossible task. Jody's sister Jana, now Jana Smith, addressed the court at the hearing, describing the long wait her family had endured both for an arrest to be made and for the trial to finally begin. Given the fact that Jody's case has the longest amount of time between the commission of the crime and a trial in Snohomish County history, Snohomish County Superior Court Judge David Kurtz was not inclined to further delay the trial. He told Miller's attorneys to buckle down and get ready. They in turn vowed to have any potential conviction overturned on appeal because they would not be able to hire and interview their own expert witness due to the time constraint. Miller's attorneys filed one more last-minute motion to have the DNA evidence in the case thrown out in October of 2020, but the motion was denied and the trial began on October 26th. The passage of time did negatively impact the trial. In addition to the evidence that had been lost over the years, several key individuals in the case had passed away. Both of Jody's parents died without knowing who killed their daughter. Her father, John, in 2005 and her mother, Rosemary, in January of 2019, less than 3 months before Miller was arrested. Walter Morris, one of the people who discovered Jody and rushed her to the hospital, died a few months prior to the trial. He had given a deposition following Miller's arrest and a video of it was played in the courtroom. His death was a problem for the prosecution because one of the alternative theories Miller's defense team put forth at trial was that Morris had been the killer, as he had been known to own a .22 caliber rifle in 1972, and he had given different reasons for why he had been in the woods that day to authorities in the various statements he had given them. His death meant that he could not be questioned about the discrepancies or explain them in court. Given the fact that he was in a secret relationship with the 18-year-old girl who was 15 years his junior who was with him at the time, there are of course obvious reasons why he may not have been forthcoming with his reasons for wanting to be alone with her in a remote wooded area. That girl, Kathy Gogol, was 66-year-old Kathy Lennox at the time of the trial and suffering from metastatic breast cancer. Despite her failing health, she managed to appear in court and was able to testify at the trial. At trial, Miller's attorneys questioned the validity of the DNA evidence, claiming that the work done on the boots was sloppy, careless, and unprofessional. They questioned why the FBI had not previously noticed the semen stain when they were asked to examine the boots in the 1970s, and criticized the sheriff's department for losing parts of the evidence log concerning them. Miller's defense attorneys also argued that there was no definitive proof that the sexual contact Jody had on the day of her death was non-consensual despite the findings of the medical examiner who performed her autopsy. They also suggested that Jody may not have been murdered at all. Instead, she may have been struck by a stray bullet, as the area where she was found was very remote at the time and popular with hunters and target shooters. The prosecution argued that none of the questions raised by the defense or the alternative scenarios they did to create reasonable doubt explained how Miller's semen ended up on the boot when there was no connection between Miller and Jody, or Miller and Jody's 12-year-old sister who had just recently gotten the boots. While the DNA was their strongest piece of evidence, the prosecution also played a phone call between Miller and his wife recorded while he was still in custody for the jury. "When it's all over and done with, the trial and all that, I'm going to be in prison. This is not a winnable case. That's the thing," Miller told his wife. "I don't like to hear that," she replied. "I know, Mama, but that's the way it is," he told her. "This is not a winnable case. This is a DNA case, and they have an extremely strong case. You're not going to beat it." Miller's attorney, "Extremely strong case. You're not going to beat it." Miller's attorneys argued that this was not Miller expressing his guilt in the case, just his fear at being wrongly convicted. The jury began their deliberations on Friday, November 6th. After a few hours, Judge Kurtz sent them home for the weekend. Deliberations resumed again first thing the following Monday morning, November 9th. Just before 10 a.m. that same morning, Miller's wife called 911, reporting that her husband had shot himself in the head. While he had been ordered to surrender any firearms he owned as one of the conditions of his release on bail, he had apparently failed to turn over one of them. He did not survive the injury. 3 hours later, the jury reached a verdict in the case. They had not been informed of Miller's death. Miller's attorneys argued against even allowing the jury to read their verdict, claiming that there was no benefit to the public in the court hearing the verdict they had reached. Prosecutors argued that Jody's family still deserved answers. Judge Kurtz agreed with the prosecution, and the verdict was read. The jury had found Miller guilty of first-degree murder. December 17, 2020 would have been the date of Miller's sentencing hearing had he not killed himself. Instead, a hearing was held to determine whether or not his conviction should stand given the fact that he had died before he could appear in court to hear the verdict. Miller's attorneys argued that the verdict should not stand but had to concede that the case law they cited in their argument did not exactly line up with the circumstances of the case at hand, a situation which Judge Kurtz described as extraordinary and somewhat unprecedented. Prosecutors argued that the verdict should stand because Miller had not died in an accident or of an illness. Rather, he had taken his own life as a means of avoiding appearing in court. Judge Kurtz ultimately ruled that throwing out the verdict was not the right thing to do. "Labels and symbols are important, and how those cases ended does matter," he told the court. Instead of sentencing Miller, as he normally would after a conviction, he instead signed a document affirming that Miller's guilt had been proven beyond a reasonable doubt in court. After the hearing, Janet Smith thanked the investigators, prosecutors, and scientists who worked so hard on her sister's case, and said that she hopes that the conviction in Jody's case will give hope to other families who are still waiting for answers in cold cases. "Truth never dies," Janice said. "They thought it was going to die. They thought it was so old that we wouldn't be able to follow through with the truth, and this helps." Back in 2014, we find ourselves in Indianapolis, the largest city in Indiana, always busy and bustling with nearly 900,000 residents. Among them were 24-year-old Nathan Benjamin Trapano and his wife, Jennifer. Nathan came from a large, close-knit family, being the fourth of 5 children. His brother often mentioned how, even though Nathan was younger, he looked up to him greatly. Nathan was a natural achiever, excelling in academics, music, and athletics. He held a black belt in karate and was skilled at both the piano and violin. Known for his wit and cleverness, he always remained humble and gracious. Nathan attended Ball State University, where he pursued a degree in Latin, Greek, and classical studies. It was at Ball State that he met Jennifer, who was training to become a nurse. The two quickly became inseparable, sharing many common interests, including strong moral values and a deep Catholic faith. Jennifer said she loved his quirkiness and how smart he was, always making her laugh and challenging her to push herself in every aspect of her life. The couple eventually moved to Indianapolis when Nathan got a job as a computer programmer at Ivy Tech Community College. Jennifer was still doing her training when they both found out they were going to be parents. They were over the moon when they discovered they were having a little girl, and they knew her name right away, Cecilia Marie. Flash forward a few months. It was now coming to the end of March 2014, and Nathan and Jennifer were busy planning. They had a lot of exciting and special days coming up. Cecilia was due in just a few weeks. Their first wedding anniversary was on May 11th, and a week after this was Nathan's 25th birthday. Safe to say there was a lot going on for the young couple, but nothing was more exciting for Nathan than becoming a father. He couldn't wait to meet his daughter. On the April 1st, 2014, Nathan was up early as normal. Having always been really active, he made sure he got a long walk or a run-in every day. He normally worked out in the evenings, but he had recently decided to change up his routine so he could be at home with Jennifer more after he finished work and before bed. Just before 5 a.m., Nathan was getting ready for an hour-long morning walk around the block before the sun rose. Nothing out of the ordinary, just the routes he always took, past the shops he normally walked by, on the roads he knew very well. He grabbed his old MP3 player, his headphones, and his rosary beads, and quietly left Jennifer asleep. At 5:50 a.m., a resident just a short walk away heard a loud popping sound. She looked out of her window to see Nathan collapsing to the ground and shouting for help. She called 911 and ran outside. She said as she got to Nathan, she could see he was only wearing his joggers. He had no shoes and no shirt on. They were just scattered around on the ground. She could see a small bullet wound in his stomach, but noticed there wasn't much blood at this point. Nathan was clearly in shock, but was still conscious and seemed to be fairly alert. However, 5 minutes later, as the ambulance and police arrived on the streets, Nathan's condition started to rapidly deteriorate. He was no longer able to talk, couldn't tell the officers anything, and was gasping for air. They managed to stabilize him, and he was rushed to hospital and straight into emergency surgery. Just after 7 a.m., Jennifer woke up, confused that her husband still wasn't home yet and getting ready for work. His phone was still on the kitchen table, but this wasn't unusual as he made sure not to take anything valuable out with him. She grabbed her coat and started walking the route he normally took, trying to calm herself down, but deep down knowing something was really wrong. Despite the best efforts of the doctors and surgeons, at 7:40 a.m., 24-year-old Nathan Trapano died. Jennifer, who was still out walking, turned a corner and saw the yellow tape everywhere and police flooding the street. She hurried over telling them her husband had left for a walk and not come home, and this was right in the middle of his route. But all they could tell her was that there had been an incident. At this point, they didn't know who the victim was as he had no ID on him, so they couldn't give Jennifer any more details. Anxiously, she showed them a picture of Nathan on her phone, asking if this was what he looked like. Officers knew it was the same person and quietly escorted her to one of the police cars to sit her down and tell her the devastating news. Jennifer, just 5 weeks away from her due date, would then learn that the love of her life was gone. One detective said he had his whole life in front of him, never been in trouble before, never been a problem, was minding his own business, doing what anybody in our community should be able to do, and that is to take a morning walk. Near to where he was found were some shell casings which matched a .40 caliber gun. Something officers said was an unusual size and not one they saw a lot. The owner of the tire shop, Jesse, knew Nathan well and saw him walk past every day, giving him a little wave as he did. After being broken into just a couple of months before, fortunately for the police, he had installed security cameras which backed onto the parking lot where Nathan was found. The footage was very grainy and blurry, but it had captured everything. Nathan could be seen walking down the road, being followed by someone who later broke into a run to keep up with him. Later on in the clip, police noticed a second person turn up who appeared to be working with the shooter. The second half of the CCTV, for obvious reasons, has only ever been partially released. At one point it looked as if Nathan was raising his hands, as if to show he was complying and would do whatever they wanted him to. But the pair backed him into the parking lot and Nathan was shot. After Nathan was down, they ran away down the main road. The only witness they had was the woman who had called 911, but by the time she got out there, they were long gone. Things were made even harder when the police started interviewing the residents of the area. They all said that sadly this was not an uncommon thing to happen. Over the years their area had gotten so much worse in terms of gun violence, with multiple shootings happening. Someone said there had been a disturbing amount of shootings and murders in the last few months alone. One theory the police had was that it was some kind of gang initiation. But another potential motive, and one they believed was more likely, was that it was a failed attempt at a robbery. Nathan's family said this made it even more senseless, as he made it a point to never go out walking with any money, cards, or his phone. The footage was sent to experts and was able to be enhanced just enough for them to work out the clothing the shooter had on. But apart from that, there was nothing. A week after Nathan had been killed, police finally made a break in the case. As they started looking into any of the shootings in the area around the same time, it came to light that just 18 hours after Nathan had died, a 16-year-old called Simeon Raheem Adams, who went by the nickname Red, was taken to hospital in a critical condition with a gunshot wound to the neck. He had shot 3 bullets at a man named Eric who had fired back at him in self-defense. Simeon was also a suspect in the burglary of a gun shop a week earlier at about 2 a.m. in which 30 firearms were stolen. And at 3 a.m. on April 1st, just 2 hours before Nathan was shot, he and 2 other men had attempted to steal a car from outside of a strip club, stopped only from doing so when the bouncer caught them. The strip club was less than a mile away from where Nathan had been walking, showing both the shooter and whoever was on lookout in the same clothing. When detectives heard about this, they knew they had to interview Simeon. He was not only confirmed as being in the same location of Nathan's shooting at the same time, he was now also facing arrest for the attempted murder of someone else, and some guns that had been stolen from the shop matched the casings found near Nathan's body. But being in the condition he was in hospital meant they had to reach out to the people in his inner circle first. The more detectives talked to people, the more they kept hearing the nickname Red floating about, linking him to numerous incidents and crimes around the area, and people he knew were picking him out of every picture lineup they showed. Martez McGraw was Simeon's cousin, and he agreed to talk. When he was shown the CCTV footage from outside of the tire shop, he immediately confirmed it was his cousin. He even admitted to being there himself for part of the morning and confirmed all of Simeon's steps and movements. The other man on the tape was identified and interviewed. After this, police ruled everyone apart from Simeon out when it came to Nathan's murder. This was the person they wanted, Martez told police. Simeon ran up to Nathan and ordered him to stop. Simeon then made him walk between the tire shop and the strip club. He made him strip by telling him to take off his shirt. He put his hands in the air and Simeon shot him. Another man also told police he was woken up early on April 1st by Simeon banging on his door. He said he was out of breath, telling him the police were looking for him because he had got into what he referred to as a tussle with someone and shot them. Although doctors were initially skeptical that Simeon would survive, he did and was finally well enough for the police to talk to him. They presented him with everything they knew, and the 16-year-old was subsequently placed under arrest. He would soon be charged as an adult with murder, attempted robbery, and carrying a handgun without a license. Upon hearing that a 16-year-old had been arrested, Jennifer posted to Facebook and said, "I don't know this man's circumstances, but it hurts to hear such a young man could turn to such violence." She asked people to pray for Simeon, and Nathan's family and friends all agreed that Nathan would have forgiven him. Nathan Trapazzano was finally laid to rest with 100 in attendance. The investigating officers all showed up too, saying what had happened to him had really struck a nerve with them and that this was a case they would remember for the rest of their lives. And a couple of weeks later, Jennifer gave birth to the couple's daughter, Cecilia Marie. A welcome burst of happiness in such a dark period of time for everyone. Their family said she looked so much like Nathan and was a wonderful, happy, and smiley little girl. As the court proceedings got underway, someone else would gain some attention. Court documents showed that the 16-year-old was free to walk the streets for a month while awaiting a hearing on 13 probation violations. The probation officer had visited his home, but on 9 occasions Simeon was nowhere to be found. After the 3rd violation, the officer could have asked for an arrest warrant, but for reasons unknown, he didn't. The judge said of this, "I expressed my extreme concern to probation about the handling of this case. When I saw there had been 9 house arrest violations, I was very concerned and upset." The probation officer in question would soon resign. Even though he was now 18 and despite being charged as an adult, because he was 16 at the time of the murder, prosecutors knew it would have been nearly impossible to get a life in prison sentence for Simeon. However, he was facing 45 to 65 years if found guilty by a jury. In 2015, just over a year after Nathan had died, Simeon Adams pleaded guilty to murder. Simeon's legal team and friends and family commented on his troubled childhood and adolescence, losing his mother to drowning when he was just 13 months old, his dad being in and out of prison for years. He had run-ins with the police that had started at the age of just 10 years old. His uncle, who had helped raise him, said, "He used to get into trouble, but I didn't think he was capable of this. I used to try to tell him not to hang with the wrong people and to stay on the right path. He listened to me. I would try to keep him in line, and if I told him to do something, he would do it. I would speak to his friends and tell them that if they didn't get themselves together, they would end up dead or in jail. I can't believe he would get involved in something like this." He was frequently shown coming in and out of court laughing, and when it came time for his sentencing, little had changed. The judge addressed him directly, asking him if he appreciated the impact of his actions on the Trapano family. He bluntly said, "No, ma'am," and nothing else after this. As part of the plea deal, his potential sentence was reduced, and he was handed down 55 years in prison. Under Indiana law, Simeon could be eligible for parole after 27 years, based on credit for good behavior and time already served. If this happens, he will be 45 years old. He was later given a further 12 years in prison in connection with the shooting of Eric, which put him in hospital in the first place. This 12 years is to be served consecutively. The loss of Nathan had a big impact. Everybody rallied behind Jennifer, and a GoFundMe was set up to support her, Cecilia, and his family. It reached over $170,000 in donations. Jennifer showed immense strength and motivation to carry on as she would have. And just a year after she lost Nathan, she finished grad school with honors and is now a physician's assistant. The Nathan Trapano Memorial Foundation was also set up, and their mission is to offer support and financial relief to children who have lost a parent. They do what they call the Nate Walk, a 5-kilometer walk, just as he loved to do, which doubles as a fundraising event. These walks are held once a year in Indianapolis and Pennsylvania, and people can also participate virtually. Ivy Tech Community College, where Nathan worked, said it would grant a full 2-year scholarship to Cecilia if she ever wanted it. Jennifer said time almost stands still and passes quicker than she can keep up with it. Whenever she doubts herself or has a difficult day with Cecilia, she asks Nathan for advice. She said, "I have a voicemail from him on March 31st, 2014. I have listened to it over and over and over again. His voice sounds so familiar still, like it was yesterday. I miss him. I miss everything about him. In so many ways, it feels like he has only been gone for 10 seconds. And yet, it feels like a 100 years. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.